I won the lottery and hid it from my poor family. But when my dad called asking for money to save our house, I discovered the real reason my family was broke and why my secrecy might have saved more than just my inheritance. And I want to tell you about the 4 months between the call and the moment I figured out my mother had been gambling away my parents' retirement for the past 11 years. I am 31. I had won a state lottery 6 months before my father's call. The win had been $7.2 million after taxes. I had taken the lump sum. I had immediately hired a financial advisor named Patrice Lemoine, who had specialized in lottery winners. Patrice had been clear from the first meeting that I should not tell my family. My parents were named Sebastian and Marisol. My parents were in their late 50s. My parents had been working blue-collar jobs for 30 years. My older brother Hendrik was 34. My younger sister Brielle was 26. Patrice had said winners who told their families lost an average of 70% of their winnings within 5 years. Patrice had said I should give myself 2 years of silence before deciding what to do with any family member. I had been keeping the secret for 6 months. I had been living in the same apartment. I had been driving the same car. I had been working the same job as a graphic designer. My father called me on a Tuesday afternoon. My father said the bank was going to foreclose on the house in 30 days. My father said the mortgage had been not paid for 6 months. My father said my parents needed $18,000 to bring the mortgage current. I called Patrice. Patrice recommended I do 2 things. The first was to say I needed 24 hours to think about it. The second was to investigate before I sent any money. I drove to my parents' city that night. I went to my parents' house the next morning. I sat with my mother in the kitchen. I asked her about the mortgage. My mother was vague. My mother said dad had been handling it. I asked my mother if she had been gambling. My mother went pale. I had been not knowing about gambling. I had been just asking. My mother had played the lottery our whole childhood and had been the family member who took us to the casino on weekend trips. The gambling had been visible to me as a normal hobby. The framing had been wrong. My mother started crying. My mother told me everything. My mother had started gambling more heavily 11 years ago after her own mother had died. My mother had started taking money from my parents' joint accounts. My mother had moved on to taking loans against the house when the retirement was gone. My mother had moved on to charging credit cards in my father's name without his knowledge. The total my mother had gambled away over 11 years was approximately $340,000. The total she still owed was approximately $90,000. I called my father. My father came home from work. My father heard the whole story for the first time at his own kitchen table. My father did not yell. My father cried for about an hour. I gave my father the $18,000 for the mortgage. I told him I had a small savings I could use. I told him I would help with the $90,000 in debt, but only if my mother went to inpatient treatment for gambling addiction. My mother agreed. After my father cried and my mother sat there staring at her hands, I drove back to the hotel. I called Patrice. She could hear it in my voice. She asked me right away how much I had told them. I said I had offered to help with the $90,000 and that I told my father I would pay for treatment. Patrice went quiet, the kind of quiet where someone is choosing their next words very carefully. Then she said, "How did you explain having that kind of money?" My stomach went tight. I had been sitting at that kitchen table watching my father cry and I had just said it. Savings. Patrice told me I needed a real story and I needed it fast. She said people who are scared about money pay very close attention to other people's money and my family was going to start thinking about where mine came from sooner than I expected. The next morning I called Sebastian to check on him. His voice sounded hollow. He told me he had been up most of the night going through the bank statements that Marisol had finally shown him. Then he said the part that made my chest hurt. He said the numbers were worse than what Marisol had told us. There were cash advances on credit cards he had never signed for. Then he said, "Your mother opened 3 credit cards in my name." I didn't know until right now. The debt was not $90,000. The debt was closer to $115,000. My mother had looked me in the face at that kitchen table and told me 90, and even that confession had been a lie. I had to decide whether to tell Hendrik and Brielle. I called Hendrik first. I told him what was going on. Hendrik did not react the way I expected. Hendrik was not upset at Marisol. Hendrik was upset at me. He said, "Why are you stirring things up? Mom and Dad have always figured it out." I told him about the credit cards. I told him Marisol had forged Sebastian's name on 3 credit card applications. Hendrik went silent. Then he said, "How do you even know all this?" I told him I drove out and asked. And Hendrik said, "You drove 4 hours on a Tuesday to interrogate Mom? What's going on with you?" Like I was the problem. I just said he should call Sebastian himself if he did not believe me, and I hung up. Then I called Brielle. Brielle started crying almost the second I told her. Brielle told me she had suspected something for years. She said Marisol had borrowed $6,000 from her over the past 2 years and had never paid any of it back. Brielle said, "I thought it was for groceries." She told me Dad's hours got cut. Brielle was the first person in the family who believed me without pushing back. She asked, "What do we do?" I told her Marisol needed treatment. Real treatment. Inpatient. Brielle was quiet for a second and then she said, "Who's paying for that?" And there it was again, the money question. I told both of my siblings, in separate calls, that I could help with some of the costs. Hendrik pushed back immediately. Hendrik said, "You're a graphic designer. You don't have treatment center money." I called Patrice. I told her the cover story of savings was not going to hold. Patrice helped me build something better. She said I should tell my family that a college mentor had passed away and left me a small inheritance. The lie felt wrong, but Patrice said, "The alternative is worse. Trust the process." I spent the next week looking for the right treatment center. I finally found one about 2 hours from my parents' house that had a program built specifically for gambling addiction. 90 days. Inpatient. The intake cost was $14,000. I called Sebastian that evening. I told him I would cover the cost. Sebastian was quiet for a few seconds, and then I heard his voice break. He said, "I don't understand how you have this money, but I'm not going to question God right now." I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, feeling this knot build in my chest, because my father was thanking God, and he was thanking me, and neither version of where the money came from was the truth. I drove back out the following weekend for a family meeting at the house. Marisol was already sitting at the kitchen table. I sat down across from her and I told her about the program. Marisol shook her head before I even finished. She said, "I don't need inpatient. I can stop on my own. I stopped before. After your grandmother died, I stopped for almost a year." And that sentence just hung in the air, because Sebastian was standing in the doorway, and Sebastian looked at Marisol and said, "You told me you never started." The room went cold. told. Marisol had told Sebastian for 11 years that she did not gamble, and now she was sitting at the table accidentally admitting she had been doing it even before the timeline she originally gave us. Sebastian turned around and walked into the living room and sat down on the couch and put his hands over his face. That was when Hendrik showed up. He came straight for me. He pulled me into the hallway. He looked at me and said, "You're embarrassing her. You're making this into something bigger than it is. She made mistakes. People make mistakes." I said, "She forged Dad's name on credit cards. That's not a mistake. That's fraud." Hendrik's jaw got tight. He said, "She's our mother." I said, "That's exactly why she needs real help." That was when Brielle walked in. Brielle came through the front door and she walked into the kitchen with her shoulders back and she sat down next to me, not next to Marisol. Brielle told everyone about the $6,000. She told them Marisol had borrowed it from her over the past 2 years. Marisol said, "I was going to pay you back." Brielle's voice cracked and she said, "With what, Mom? You don't have anything left." Nobody said anything for a while. Then Marisol put her face in her hands and started crying, loud crying. And through the crying, she said, "Okay." She said she would go. She said she would do the 90 days. Sebastian walked over and put his hand on Marisol's shoulder. Hendrik walked over to me and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to come at you like that." There was this moment where the whole family was together, and it felt like we had found the bottom, and now we were going to start climbing out. Sebastian thanked me again. He held my face in his hands and said I was the strongest person in the family. I almost told him the truth right there. I almost said it, but I didn't. 3 days before the intake date, my phone rang. It was Marisol. Her voice was different, almost casual. She said she was not going. She said she had been looking online and she found a support group she could do from home. She said she did not need to go away for 90 days. I set the glass down on the counter because my hand was starting to shake. I said, "Mom, you agreed." She said, "I agreed because everyone was pressuring me. I've had time to think about it and I don't need that." 2 days later, Brielle texted me. Brielle sent me a screenshot. It was a transaction notification from the family's shared phone plan. The screenshot showed a charge to an online gambling platform, then another one, $400 total. Marisol had gambled $400 in the 72 hours since she had agreed to treatment. I called everyone. I told them we were meeting at the house. I drove the 4 hours again. When I walked into my parents' house, everyone was already there. I sat down and I pulled out my phone and I opened the screenshot. I put the phone on the table and slid it toward the middle so everyone could see. I said, "This is a charge to an online gambling site, $400, 3 separate charges over 3 days. The same 3 days she was telling us she was ready to go to treatment." Marisol looked at the screen and then looked away. She said, "That's not me. That account must have been hacked. Someone could have used my information. I didn't do that." I looked at Sebastian. He looked like a man who had run out of every kind of energy a person has. And he said, "Stop. Please just stop." Marisol kept going. She said, "You're all ganging up on me. You're looking for reasons to send me away." And then Marisol's face changed. The denial kind of flickered, like a light right before it goes out. She put her arms on the table and she put her head down on her arms and she just stayed there. And after a while, in a voice that was muffled by her sleeves, she said, "I thought if I won enough to cover the intake cost, you wouldn't have to pay." Nobody moved. Brielle put her hand over her mouth. My mother had been told that her daughter was going to pay $14,000 to save her life. And instead of accepting that, she had gone to the same place that had destroyed everything and tried to win the money herself. I looked at Marisol, who still had her head on the table, and I said, "Mom, look at me." She lifted her head. Her face was blotchy and wet. I said, "You are going to treatment. That is not a request. That is the only option. If you do not go, I will not help with a single dollar of the debt. Not one payment. Not one phone call to a creditor. Nothing." I looked at Sebastian. I said, "Dad, I love you. But if she does not go, I cannot help. I will not put money into a situation that is not going to change." Sebastian looked at me for a long moment and then he nodded. Hendrik pushed off the counter. Hendrik said, "You're holding the family hostage." I looked at my brother. I said, "No, the gambling is holding the family hostage. I'm offering the way out, and it comes with one condition." Hendrik opened his mouth like he was going to argue, but nothing came out. The room stayed quiet for a while. Then Marisol wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "Okay." She said she would go. While we were sitting there talking through the details, Marisol looked at me and said, "Can I use your phone? I want to call the center myself. I want to do this part on my own." It sounded so reasonable. So I handed her my phone. She was in there for maybe 10 minutes. She came back and gave me the phone and said, "They sound nice. I think it'll be okay." I did not think about it again until that night. I was back at the hotel. I picked up my phone to set an alarm, and that is when I noticed it. My recent contacts list. The contact read, Patrice Lemoine, financial advisor. Right there. The contacts app had been opened. Someone had scrolled through it. My whole body went cold. I called Patrice. She told me to change the contact name in my phone immediately. Then Patrice said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. She said, "Your mother is an addict. Addicts look for leverage. If she finds out about the money, she will use it. Not because she's evil, because that's what addiction does." I sat in the hotel parking lot because the room had felt too small and I just cried. The next morning, Marisol called me. She said she was ready. She said she wanted me to drive her. For the first 40 minutes, Marisol did not say a word. Then, right around the time we merged onto the highway, Marisol said, "I saw a name on your phone." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Marisol said, "Patrice something, a financial advisor." I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Marisol turned to look at me. She said, "Why does a graphic designer with savings from a mentor need a financial advisor?" I had about 3 seconds to answer. I said, "Patrice is a friend from college who works in finance. She helped me set up a savings plan. That's it." Marisol kept looking at me. After what felt like forever, Marisol said, "Okay, just that, one word." I delivered my mother to the front door of the treatment center and I watched her walk inside with her bag over her shoulder. 3 weeks went by. 3 weeks of quiet. And then Hendrik called. His voice was off. He said, Mom called me from the center. She told me something interesting. She told me you had a financial advisor, that you had been lying about where the money was coming from. So I looked into it. A mentor inheritance? Really? I called your old college. Your advisor died 15 years ago and didn't leave money to students. I did not say anything. My cover story was coming apart like wet paper. 2 days later, Hendrik drove to my apartment. He did not call ahead. He stood in my living room with his jacket still on and he said, where is the money coming from? I said, I've been saving. Hendrik shook his head. He said, you paid $14,000 for treatment. You offered to cover $90,000 in debt. You gave dad $18,000 for the mortgage. That's over $100,000. You make $52,000 a year. The math doesn't work. He was right. The math did not work. I looked at Hendrik standing there in my living room and I made a decision. I said, I need you to sit down. I told him about the lottery. I told him the amount. I told him about Patrice and her advice and why I had kept it a secret from every single person in my life. Hendrik stared at me. Then he said, you've had $7 million for almost a year and you watched us lose the house. I said, I didn't watch you lose the house. I saved the house. I paid for mom's treatment. I'm handling the debt. Hendrik said, you could have fixed everything from day one. I said, and if I had, mom would have never gotten treatment. She would have asked me for money instead. How long do you think 7 million lasts when an addict knows it exists? Hendrik did not answer. Then he said, you have to tell dad. I said, no. He said, he deserves to know. I said, does he? Because right now, dad thinks his daughter saved them through hard work and sacrifice. That's the version that keeps him standing. If he finds out about the lottery, the first thing mom hears in recovery is that there's millions of dollars in the family. What do you think that does to her treatment? Hendrik opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He sat back down. I told him that if he told anyone, the money would go into a trust that nobody in the family could access, that Patrice had already set it up as a safeguard. Hendrik looked at me and said, you planned for this? I said, Patrice planned for this, because this is what always happens. Hendrik agreed to keep the secret, but he asked me to promise that when Marisol was stable and the debt was paid, I would tell Sebastian, not for the money, for the honesty. I said I would. I called Patrice. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, one person knowing is manageable. 2 is a pattern. Be careful. 6 months later, Marisol completed treatment and moved back home. I drove out for a family dinner. Sebastian looked 10 years younger, like someone had given him his life back. Marisol said grace before dinner. She thanked the family for not giving up on her. She looked at me and said, I don't know how you did what you did, but you saved this family. I said, you saved this family, Mom. You went to treatment. That was you. After dinner, I sat on the porch with Sebastian. He said, I don't know what you've been doing or how you've been doing it, but I stopped asking because I figured if you wanted me to know, you'd tell me. And whatever it is, you're my daughter, and I trust you. I leaned into my father's shoulder and said nothing. The lottery money is still mostly intact. Marisol has been clean for 6 months. Hendrik has kept the secret. I carry the weight of what I know, and I carry it on purpose, because the silence is not a lie. The silence is a wall I built around the people I love, and I am the only one strong enough to hold it up.